Pronto? Working? Yes. So, grazie molto di essere qui al Castello di Rivoli per questo intervento di Carmen Mörsch nell'ambito del workshop del CRRI sui temi della, chiamiamola, educazione, mediazione, apertura, relazione con l'arte. Vorrei, prima di passare la parola ad Andrea Vigliani, che introdurrà Carmen, ringraziare chi rende possibile i nostri progetti. Il Castello di Rivoli è sostenuto principalmente dalla Regione Piemonte e anche dalla città di Torino, dalla città di Rivoli e dalla Fondazione CRT, la Fondazione CRT per l'arte moderna e contemporanea, la Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo e in partenariato anche con Intesa San Paolo e Gallerie d'Italia. I hope I didn't miss anybody. Anyway, in particolare il programma che facciamo oggi è legato a un progetto di workshops per la formazione delle figure che hanno piacere di lavorare nell'ambito artistico, una serie che comprende workshop sulle attività registrariali, di studi di provenienza, archivistica, di redazione di cataloghi e adesso anche di edizione, educazione artistica. Questo programma è in particolare una delle fiori all'occhiello del nostro CRRI, sostenuto primariamente dalla Compagnia di San Paolo e anche dall'interesse per l'arte della Tosetti Family Office. Quindi ringrazio tutte queste persone. But mainly I would like to thank you for being here, for all the workshop students, the people who are or participants or agents or whatever Carmen wishes to call all of you. And I would like to thank you for coming because it is a great honor and pleasure. I've always admired your work very, very much and was in contact with it at the time or with part of it, a very small part of a vast life, but connected with the Documenta and your enormous impact on that of the Documenta 12, actually, not mine. So I would like to invite Andrea to come up and maybe introduce our speaker today. And I know that I've brought you back to a very traditional format, asking you to do this, but someone, an Italian artist of the late 60s, Mattarese, very strange person, did a work called Le contraddizioni sono ovunque, right? Big striscione. So there you go, contradictions are everywhere.
Grazie al nostro direttore e benvenute e benvenuti a tutti. Vi presento appunto con una brevissima introduzione la conferenza della professoressa Carmen Mörsch che fa parte del workshop di quest'anno per la formazione di esperti in educazione nelle istituzioni culturali. Abbiamo parlato molto di educazione, di mediazione, di anticoloniale, decoloniale, postcoloniale, saranno tutti termini che ritorneranno fra poco nella conferenza intitolata Critical Diversity Literacy in Museum and Gallery Education, Historical Grounds, Present Challenges. La conferenza introdurrà appunto il concetto di Critical Diversity Literacy, un concetto per l'educazione alla giustizia sociale che è stato sviluppato da Melissa Steyn, una studiosa di studi sulla comunicazione sudafricana bianca. Non approfondisco perché sarà appunto il tema che stiamo per ascoltare, mentre volevo introdurvi brevissimamente la biografia della professoressa Mörsch, che è appunto professoressa di educazione artistica all'Accademia d'Arte di Mainz, Università Johannes Gutenberg in Germania. I suoi interessi sono rivolti alla ricostruzione di storie, concetti e pratiche nell'educazione artistica da un punto di vista queer, femminista e intersezionale. Dal 2008 al 2018 ha lavorato come responsabile dell'Istituto di ricerca per l'educazione artistica all'Università delle Arti di Zurigo in Svizzera. Insieme a Nora Landkammer costituisce il collettivo IAR, che sta per Education and Arts Research. È membro del network internazionale Another Roadmap for Arts Education, una rete di professionisti che collaborativamente cercano di decolonizzare l'istituzione artistica, soprattutto in campo istituzionale. Grazie, professor Mörsch, a lei la parola.
Thank you. And Andrea and Caroline, thank you very much for the invitation. And I have to reply, Caroline, that this position here is not contradictory for me at all, because it's one of my biggest pleasures and desires to sit on a high chair talking to people and they're listening to me. So no contradiction whatsoever. I love the stage and I love monologuing, so I'm in my element. You heard already a lot about me and just by Andrea, and I just wanted to say or to add that I also worked as a freelance artist educator for 10 years in museums, galleries, schools, adult education, and also with youth. Before I started to research and write about these practices, and I consider myself very much a practitioner. And I enjoyed very much the 3 days, or 3.5 days actually already, which the participants of the workshop here and I could spend together. Most, or at least half of the audience here comprises of those participants, and I want to take the opportunity to also thank them for the wonderful time we have been having here at Castello di Rivoli until now. For them, this lecture here is actually also kind of shifting the attention from a more general analysis of what the practice of museum and gallery education can be to the paradigm of decolonization, which you find in the title of the workshop of this summer school. And so it also serves more or less as an introduction of the next phase of our teaching and learning. So I start to read because that will be the only way of how I can keep up with the time limit, the schedule. For some years now, my work has been focusing on what it is called critical diversity literacy in art education for schools, museums, and galleries. Today, I will offer you a little introduction into what that actually means. It is important for me to state in the beginning that I'm talking from a white European perspective, and that a negotiation of this standpoint underlies both my analysis and my suggestions for action. As an image, to begin with though, I chose a still from a recent work of Black US-American artist Nina Chanel Abney called Imaginary Friend. The imaginary friend, and you see it here, the imaginary friend is a virtual reality figure resembling a kind of black sage, which one can project via an application, a digital app, into any self-chosen surrounding. The sage then tells you a story about how they have been trying to give blessings, but the offer got refused, based on the conviction that nothing good could ever happen to the receiver. I chose this shot of the imaginary friend in front of the Louvre, Paris, France, one of the earliest and most emblematic European universal museums, as a reminder and a provocation. As a reminder of the international Black Lives Matter movement and the fights for anti-racism in the Americas and worldwide from Black and indigenous perspectives, which are a driving force behind the pressure for change many institutions, many cultural institutions, have been starting to experience recently. I will come back to this pressure in a minute. I chose the image as a provocation because I assume the story of the refused sage, a fitting metaphor. Museum and gallery education, as well as curatorial practice informed by critical diversity literacy, seems like a blessing offered to cultural institutions on the European continent, which is getting refused on the grounds that epistemological change, radical transformation of this institution type is unlikely, if not impossible, to occur, and certainly unwanted by many of the institutional protagonists. Which is a shame because profound change would be indicated for these institutions to stay relevant in the future. At least that's my opinion. Let me continue with a little vignette, a small case study recently told to me by one of my students. A museum visit with a school group. The only black kid in the group raises their hand and asks, "Is this painting connected to colonialism?" The teacher responds, "Our topic today is impressionism, not colonialism, so let's continue with that." Now, I could spend the rest of the time reserved for this lecture to analyze this incident. I could talk about the patronizing way the student response is treated and that it is not what one should expect from art education in the present to look like. Instead, every perspective of every learner should be taken serious and as a gift to the teacher. I could further talk about how the response of the teacher only echoes the fundamental whiteness of museums, of schools, of art education, and particularly of European art history. I could talk about which knowledge is important, which is dominant, is canonized, and even recognized as knowledge at all, and which knowledges are minorized and delegitimized. But what really interests me is that this story did occur at all. The student was talking back. They were able to decipher the colonial condition underlying Manet's painting, and they had the courage to utter it, to expose a problem. And as feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed from England would have it, by exposing a problem, they turned into a problem, needed to be silenced and kept under control by denial. So much energy is put into denial and sublimation on a daily basis in almost every school and almost every museum in the world that I would suggest to include the production of denial and of other defense mechanisms into the new Icom definition of museums, which is currently and controversially under construction, as people who are familiar with museums workings might know. Big conflict about the new definition. Icom definition of museum. So I suggest a museum is a non-profit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment, and which denies its own colonial foundations and its epistemic violence with dauntless effort. End of fictional quote. So the school students spoke back. They had the courage to utter knowledge coming from another standpoint, knowledge the teacher didn't have. And although their intervention got silenced, it survived as a story, as a case study, as a vignette. It got observed by university students with knowledge informed by critical diversity literacy, who took the time and the effort to tell it back to their professor, me, who takes the opportunity of this lecture to tell it to you, an audience of museum workers and educators and cultural workers and interested people, of course, as well. The intervention of the student thus becomes part of a growing pressure movement, put forward mainly by people, the sociologist Nirmal Purwa in a book from 2004 called Space Invaders. People whose bodies appear unexpected in institutions, namely in positions of power, because those institutional spaces were not conceived for them. They do not represent what Purwa called the somatic norm of a space. More and more space invaders have recently invaded the space of white liberal progressive cultural institutions. their unforeseen bodies and their claims causing what Puva coined as an ontological crisis. Those who in those institutions used to provoke not much but a patronizing white savior complex and a desperate hope for finally diversifying audiences, now work as consultants and in boards that decide over the allocation of funds. They appear in museums and galleries and ask to get their property back. They petition for director positions, for radical structural change, for the rewriting of narratives, histories, of catalog and wall texts, of press announcement, of habitual conventions. The protests, interventions, the pressure they create concern not only museums but all cultural institutions. Here is only one example, the current developments in art schools within German-speaking countries. A nationwide network comprised of students and staff called Anti-Racist and Anti-Sexist Education for Art Schools. Note the subject of education that the education is targeted towards. Here an image of an anti-racist protest of students from the University of Arts Berlin on the Open House exhibition 2020. And here the website of a project called Foundation Class at Art School Berlin-Weißensee, which aims to support refugee artists on their way into the official academic system in Germany, and which explicitly distances itself from any kind of patronizing charity or help approach. And I quote from the website, "Rather than providing short-term solutions and services to refugee and asylum seekers, which in many cases mainly benefit the primarily white German facilitators or charitable institutions, the foundation class attempts to be a legal tool that prepares the ground for refugee and asylum seekers' equal access to the institutionalized arts and cultural sectors." End of quote. One of the ways foundation class is different from similar endeavors is that they basically exclusively employ teachers of color, preferably with similar experiences of flight and relocation as the students of the class. Foundation class has been invited to work with Documenta this year, one of the widely received international art exhibitions that happen every 5 years in the city of Kassel, Germany. As have the Africa cluster of the before mentioned Another Roadmap for Arts Education, part of a network of art education dissenters that got funded in 2011 in the course of a critical analysis of the UNESCO Roadmap for Art Education's paternalistic, neoliberal, and neocolonial subtext, and has been developing several practice and research projects ever since. A network to which I myself owe a big deal of knowledge and my approach towards education today. It seems thus that more and more constituencies worldwide are joining forces to do away with the dominance of white Western views and manners in cultural institutions. After having summoned some of them, I will now proceed to sketch some perspectives for critical diversity literacy in museum and gallery education. I initiate this section of the presentation by conjoining myself with the line of a song of the Mexican queer feminist performance collective Invasorics, a name that, by the way, again points to the motive of space invaders. They ask who will join to excommunicate universality. Because this is about nothing less than this, the provincialization of Western universality by applying a critique of its coloniality. To understand what critical diversity literacy is about, it is thus necessary to have a quick look at this critique. So what does coloniality mean? Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano described coloniality as the dominant condition of the world, how it had evolved since the beginning of the European colonial conquest, since the 16th century. This conquest is characterized by the control of economy, for example, land appropriation, the exploitation of labor, control of natural resources, the control of authority, the control of gender and sexuality, the control of subjectivity and knowledge. So basically the control of our ways of coming into being, coming into existence. Coloniality as a global condition leads to what has been described as the colonial bias, or how educationalists Pam Christie and Carolee McKinney put it, quote, the underside of modernity included the slave trade, fratricidal colonial wars of conquest, negative development, violent civilizing missions, forcible Christianization, material dispossessions, and other forms of violence. The upper side of modernity included the flowering of individual liberties, universal suffrage, mass democracy, secularization and emancipation of the masses from the tyranny of tradition and religion, rationality and scientific spirit, popular education, technology, and many other accomplishments. But for one to experience the lethal or enriching aspects of modernity depended on which side of the abyssal lines one was located, as well as the racial category into which one was classified. Based on these observations, and you notice that's the theory part of the thing, you know, I started like innocently amusing, giving lots of images and examples, and now it's like the chewing part. So based on these observations, Puerto Rican sociologist Ramon Grossvogel, together with colleagues from the collective Modernidad, Colonidad, developed a tool for the description of the Western modern condition, of the world which they coined as the colonial matrix of power. This matrix comprises of several intertwined strands. A particular global class formation with a diversity of labor forms, an international division of core and periphery, an interstate political military system controlled by Europe or the West, a global racial ethnic hierarchy privileging white European people, a global gender hierarchy privileging European patriarchy, a sexual hierarchy privileging heterosexuals, a spiritual hierarchy privileging Christianity, an epistemic hierarchy privileging Western knowledge and cosmology, a linguistic and cultural hierarchy privileging European languages, English especially, as we can see in this occasion again, in communication and knowledge theory production. So to sum it up, our normality, as you might have noticed already. It sounds complicated, basically it is what you not take into account because you're so used to it. Coloniality thus is understood as the foundation of Western societies and thus underlies also our work as art educators. For many practicing in the spirit of this insight, I let you now contemplate for some minutes on this image, drawn from the website of the German Ministry of Culture and dating from January 2021. By then it served as the anchor image for the funding area of the ministry called Art Education and Integration. Contemplating the image, you should keep in mind that the term integration in Germany is fundamentally racialized, meaning the imperative of integration that is targeted, meaning the imperative of integration is targeted exclusively to a certain minorized section of the population, which is under suspicion to not subdue under the lifestyle and mindset of Western capitalist liberalism, and thus has to be persuaded or forced to do so. European art education has been playing a role as a disciplining tool within this narrow and specific project of integration for a long time. So with this information in mind, please contemplate the image and within it try and trace some of the strands of coloniality, namely a global racial hierarchy privileging white European people, a global gender hierarchy privileging European patriarchy, a sexual hierarchy privileging heterosexuals, and an epistemic hierarchy privileging Western knowledge and cosmology. By the way, the image had been taken down just some few months after they put it up, so somebody might have noticed the involuntary joke. You know, it didn't stay for long. I have to say, you know, to be fair. This little reading exercise pointed to museum and gallery education's complicity in coloniality. Alas, at the same time, and as many in this audience might be aware of, museum and gallery educators often are the most passionate forces for change within the institutions. There is a lot of critical and transformative work happening in the field. One example I showed on this slide just to indicate that you might like to have a look at some moment, the Lab Bode initiative from Berlin, which happened also all over Germany for several years, introducing issues like sex education and approaches informed by critical race theory in many museum departments in Germany. But this project also showed one more time very clearly the work of transforming the museum is more than often delegated to the education department alone, helping the institution as a whole to remain the status quo. At the same time, museum and gallery educators are often precarious workers with little institutional agency. It is thus sometimes hard for them to embrace their own position of power. But this self-reflection is necessary if educators do not want to continue reproducing coloniality within their work. It needs an attitude that currently is often described as decolonial. For the European context, I have to admit that I'm hesitating to use this term all too enthusiastically, as I do not think it is possible to escape the colonial matrix of power. Since 2017, I have instead been working together with many colleagues on a curriculum for educators who work in museum and gallery education, who teach art in schools or in adult and youth education to acquire what is called critical diversity literacy. This curriculum is scheduled, or had been published in March 2022. The concept of critical diversity literacy was developed about a decade ago by South African scholar Melissa Steyn, whose research has been focusing on critical whiteness since post-apartheid. Referencing Black US American scholar and filmmaker Franz Wyndham Stein's concept of racial literacy, Steyn defines critical diversity literacy as a reading practice which perceives and responds to social climates and prevalent structures of oppression. She defined 8 indicators to evaluate the presence of critical diversity literacy in any given social context. And these indicators are an understanding that social identities are learned and an outcome of social practices. As one field-specific illustration, you see here a depiction of a private view of an art exhibition in Paris in the 19th century. The term vernissage, which you might be familiar with, which is used until today also in my country for those events, stems from the fact that during the private view then, which was only accessible for the social elites, artists were still varnishing their paintings. So they were just putting on the last strokes. So I just take this as an illustration for what it could mean to understand that social identities are learned and an outcome of social practices. I will not go very deep into the different indicators here today because it's not doable in 50 minutes. But the group that's going to work with me another week in October, I promise that we will look deeper into those indicators. Second, a recognition of the symbolic and material value of hegemonic identities, such as whiteness, masculinity, heterosexuality, able-bodiness, middle-classness, etc. I think that's an easier one to understand with this illustration. You see Hasso Plattner, founder of the global software company SAP and owner of an estimated 12 billion euros, opening the Palais Barberini in Potsdam, which he let be built to host his art collection. And you see the website of that place offering an education program. According to Steyn, the third indicator is an analytic skill at unpacking how these systems of privilege intersect, interlocked, co-construct, and constitute each other, an indicator closely linked to intersectionality as it was developed by US-American legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. And here you do not only see Kimberly Crenshaw, but also a quote that kind of breaks intersectionality very nicely down and makes it feasible to understand when you hear Audre Lorde saying, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. The next indicator is that critical diversity literacy needs the ability to position oneself intersectionality in the social space, as has been done here in this illustration by Kübra Ural when she was a first-year student in my art education class, situating herself intersectionally within the specific context of studying art education at Mainz Academy of the Arts at Johannes Gutenberg University in Germany. And that is also an exercise the poor participants of the summer school will have to go through in the week in October. And here's myself sweating over the same exercise and trying to position myself intersectionally for a text which I wrote for a book of foundation class, which I mentioned earlier. I wrote, this proposal is written by a white, fat, genderqueer, low-income, highly dysfunctional patchwork family background person that during meanwhile 52, by the way, meanwhile it's 54, years on the planet Earth has been accumulating an enormous amount of symbolic capital, currently working as an art education professor with a lifelong generous salary in the German academic system, most of the time being surrounded by love, care, and support. That's me, living a dream I have never been entitled to dream of, a joyful life in the jolly state of mimicry. Intertwined with all of this is, according to Steyn, the development of a vocabulary that facilitates a discussion of forms of oppression and resistance, but also, in the case of art education, the development of a critical language specific for the professional field. For example, if I put decolonial art into my search engine because I'm aching to prepare a class countering the Eurocentric canon, I can get very different results than if I put in African art, as I did as an educator trying to introduce matter beyond the European art historical canon for the first time, some time ago. The latter leads to a mirroring of the Western gaze on the continent and thus reproduces Eurocentrism, not deconstructing it. But first you have to know which terms you use for your search. So that's also an example of what it means to develop a vocabulary. And tightly intertwined with this indicator is the ability to translate and interpret coded hegemonic practices, or as Steyn puts it, being able to identify the encoding of privilege and prejudice requires that one unpack or read between the lines of official organizational language, which is usually carefully crafted to comply with organizational procedure and maintain its public image. As an illustration of a hegemonic practice in our working field, you see here a photo of the final all-white panel of a conference on museums, diversity and inclusion, organized by the German Association of Museum Education in 2017. When I'm doing this lecture or similar ones in Germany, usually people laugh at that point. Anyway. Connected with the decoding of hegemony is the understanding of oppressive systems as a historical legacy and continuity in the present. To illustrate those continuities, I again give you an example. If I would like to find educational material in German language about the white French post-impressionist painter Paul Gauguin online, I find thousands and thousands of examples. But if I would like to find educational material on Amrita Shergill, queer woman artist of Indian-Hungarian descent, key artist of Indian modernism, who studied painting at the Grand Chaumière Academy in Paris and who already in 1935 deconstructed the sexism and exoticism in Gauguin's painting in her self-portrait as a Tahitian woman, which she painted shortly before she decided to leave Europe for good and continue her artistic practice in India. At least in German languages, I find nothing. I do not find anything. No material I could use as a teacher on Amrita Shergill. Within the curriculum which we have developed, we apply each of the named indicators, like the ones which I just presented to you, of critical diversity literacy to 3 dimensions that are cutting across the field of art education: canon, methods, and structures. Canon refers to the questions: what is the content of the work? Which sources and protagonists are we referencing? I just gave you an example for that. Connected with the dimension of methods is the question how we are doing the work, and structures ask what are the conditions, principles, and foundations that underlie the work. So for a mini practicing in the spirit of the curriculum, I let you now, after a lot of input, contemplate again for some minutes. Again on the same image from before, even if a bit unnerving, so you are already familiar with it. This time, please try and think about canon, methods, and structures through a critical diversity literacy lens. So what are the references? How are things done? And what are the conditions of the work? The exercise may or may not have evoked in some of you the last indicator for critical diversity literacy. The last indicator Steyn describes as an engagement with issues of transformation of these oppressive systems towards deepening democracy and social justice in all levels of social organization. That's a very important indicator. I deviate from my text now because if you have all those those knowledges, if you fulfill all these indicators, you know about the social construction of identities, you know about intersectionality, you know about hegemonic coding, etc., the legacy of historical grown oppression. You can still use that more as an instruction sheet, right? You can use it to perpetuate, to reproduce oppressive conditions. So the last indicator is quite key. The will to change, basically. With this indicator, Steyn refers to Brazilian radical educator Paulo Freire's concept of conscientization. This concept has been under critical scrutiny, and I will come to those critiques soon in this last part of my lecture. I have to hurry up, actually. This concept, but first, before I come to the critiques, I would like to state what I'm getting from this indicator for the critical diversity literacy art education curriculum. An orientation towards co-constructive learning and towards action research. On this image, you can see the basic structure of the curriculum. The indicators for critical diversity literacy are spelled out for the dimensions, canon, methods, and structures. This spelling out is then translated into an action research process. So learners try and change some aspects in their own practice, be it individually, in a team, collective, or even institutionally. And then they come back and reflect on these trials, and then they try again, and so it goes on. To exemplify, I would like to mention here a joint project by a museum educator and a press officer that later also involved the responsible curator of a huge art museum in Germany, the Ludwig Museum in the city of Cologne. The project was developed within the framework of action, research, reflection workshops that I offered in the years of 2019 and 2020 for practitioners from cultural institutions in East and West Germany. The colleagues from the Ludwig Museum worked on racist, sexist, exoticizing representations, titles, and paintings within the museum's collection of expressionist paintings, a collection the museum is especially famous for and proud of. Focusing on an outstanding example, they worked around Otto Müller's painting with the title Two Gypsy Women with a Cat. The dehumanizing depiction of the two women in the painting is particularly violent on the backdrop of ongoing discrimination of the Sinti and Romnia community in Europe, including Germany. As stated in April 2021 by the According National Association, quote, Sinti and Romnia have lived on the European continent for at least 600 years, but the members of the diverse and heterogeneous communities are still affected by discrimination, persecution, poverty, and social exclusion. Even in 2021, access to basic rights such as health, housing, education, and work is still not guaranteed. Around 80,000 to 140,000 Sinti and Romnia live in Germany, and an estimated 10 to 12 million in the EU, making them the largest ethnic minority in Europe. The colleagues from the Ludwig Museum worked in alliance with activist self-organizations of Sinti and Romnia in Cologne. With their consultation, wall texts were exchanged, critical comments of titles were added to paintings, anti-racist educational activities and information materials were developed and publicly provided. A display was curated that confronted expressionist painter Otto Müller's depiction of Sinti with a documentary film of the situation of that community in post-war Germany. The two colleagues created a fanzine about this project and their dealings with the difficult negotiations it comprised on many levels. This fanzine now is part of the curriculum material. It serves to pass through the knowledge gained from their experience to other protagonists who are invested in the killjoy endeavor to intervene and interrupt the coloniality of cultural institutions in this geopolitical region. As most audience members be able to imagine, the translation of critical diversity literacy in museums and galleries, be it education or curating, can be draining, and it comes with a lot of contradictions and ambivalences. To conclude, I would like to draw on the critique of Paulo Freire's concept of consensization, as it has been developed by Peruvian scholar Grimaldo Rengifo. Basically, he criticizes the unquestioned rooting of critical pedagogy itself within European Enlightenment. As that, it imposes this epistemology on the Andinian people by emphasizing the value of cognitive reasoning and relegating the sensual and affective, as well as relatedness, to a subordinate position. Another extremely relevant and valid set of objections come from the school of thought of Walter Benjamin and also Black studies, which all reject the permanent evocation of a better future that forms the basis of most activism and definitely of any endeavor of critical pedagogy as a strategy to actually stabilize the dominant order. Because if you always postpone the betterment to the future, you do not have to act now. Thus, I would like to end with a set of working principles that inform the curriculum and that try to tackle those indisputably justified critiques. Recognize situated and minorized knowledges and bodies. Co-construct brave spaces where it is possible to utter those knowledges. And with brave space, I do not mean necessarily always a physical space, but a movement. Acknowledge the impact of time, bodies and emotion in learning. Embrace collectivity in reciprocity and abandon paternalism. Connect with others in struggle, reference, network, learn. Foster preciseness, complexity, and embarrassability. Embarrassability meaning the ability to be embarrassed. An affinity for ambiguity. And opt for the abandonment of hope. Deconstructing enthusiasm. Instead of deferring to a supposedly better future, stay in the present with the trouble. The future started to happen in the 19th century. For example, when Black people in the US organized the first museums for themselves, and is happening all the time. Deconstruct heroism, embrace subversiveness, choose your battles, practice radical self-care. Thank you very much for your attention. Is it just me that is sweating, or is it hot in here? Is it hot in here, or is it just me? Are you also hot? Or are you refreshed? Yeah, you're hot. That's good. It's good to save energy.
Se ci sono delle domande da parte vostra?
Just want to be sure that it's not a heat wave I'm experiencing.
1000 domande. Beh.
Carolyn, ask me a question.
No, it's fantastic. First of all, thank you. Of course, very interesting and very clear. I was thinking about the Otto Müller painting. So,
Which painting? Otto Müller.
yeah. So the question, of course, is what is the responsibility of the artist, if there is, and yeah, I was thinking, is that what does it mean? Is that necessarily a racist painting? Or is it intersectionally more about naked women in art, which have always been in art? So, in a way, my question is, what do you do with great art that is problematic? And what does great mean? I mean, is that a colonial term? How do you deal, let's say, with the curatorial departments of the museums? Because there's an education question, generally related to mediation with the so-called audience or public or visitors. And then there's the other question, which is the museum working on the cultural practices at a time, including work that is politically problematic. So fundamentally, it's the Ezra Pound question. What do you do with Ezra Pound in 1940?
Yeah, I find the way that process developed especially beautiful because the impulse came from a person from the education department and from press. And first, there was a lot of resistance in the the expert curators from the time. But then when they got the organization in the boat, you know, when they involved the local Citizen Romnia cultural organization, and a dialogue started, and it became clear that it is not about censorship at all, but it is more about framing. And it's also not the question whether, I mean, I would answer to that question as a historian, that if I would like to research on that question, whether that image would have taken a racist stance by the time it was produced, I need to know what else was produced by the time, right? So I can't answer that question just spontaneously. It needs like thorough research, you know, which kind of alternatives, you know, were at hand, you know, and how would we then contextualize this work with its title within a wider frame. And then, of course, you can also say it's not about intentionality. If you think with the tools of intersectionality, and then you also think about structures and not necessarily about, I'm going to make a racist depiction of citizen Romnia women, but, you know, like the underlying coloniality, which nobody can escape. But the actual way of how they dealt with, I liked very much because they, of course, it was never about censorship. It was about how would you comment on that image? How would you contextualize it in a text? And I also liked very much the intervention, which was not done by the education department, but by the curator herself, who decided that she will research on that film, you know, with, I don't remember, unfortunately now, the name of the director, but it was a film from the 60s, showing the actual situation of Sinti and Romnia in Germany by the time. And that was like the painting hung on one wall and then in a darker part of the room, but not in a black box, so the two could interfere with each other. You could see the film. And that actually really was a beautiful display. You know, the two interacted very interestingly with each other. So I think for me, it is not so much about being judgmental or being executing censorship, but it is more like letting yourself be provoked, you know, by the actual questions that are asked, and in this case, then also were asked by this association, you know, and see what you can do with that provocation. Yeah. Otherwise, it would just be a very in a way, from my point of view, if it would be about censorship or despising the actual piece, it would also be a kind of a reproduction of violence in a way, you know, because it's a very phallic way of dealing with things. But that was not the case in this. Yeah. Yes. Yes. It actually was very multi-layered and beautifully processed. Yeah. processed. But in the beginning, it was like this, you know, you pose an accusation, you pose a problem, so you become a problem. So there was some work needed. And what I really like in this example, that it was actually the bringing to the table representatives from the community, you know, including them in the dialogue, which really made the thing like turn into something productive. Yeah. And of course, I'm totally proud and absolutely excited when these things are happening in the framework of my actual research stuff. You know, so I can only be in love with it. So maybe if you're really curious, you should also talk to Yilmaz because you might be familiar with Yilmaz Cevior, the director. And I also think that this could happen is because he, as a director, is really interested in those questions. And so he also is very open to that, you know, and interested in what happens when you follow those lines of thought.
Sì,
There's
c'è
a
una...
hand rise. Yeah, a hand is rising.
Quindi tu sarai la terza domanda di nuovo? Ecco.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for the presentation, which was very interesting. I have a question about the term coloniality.
Coloniality, the concept?
Yeah, more the term.
The term. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it seems in part to be connected to a specific historical moment between the 16th and the 19th century. In the new historical moment, some of these aspects have changed. For example,
some of the relations, right?
Yeah, for example, the centrality of Europe is long gone. The centrality of Christianity is being supplanted by secularization. Patriarchy is also evolving into something new, yet similar forms of domination remain. So I wonder if, aside from post-colonial, if there is another word that can be used to understand similar relationships that are not based on this kind of 16th, 19th century imagination, which is very typical to this particular picture, with the new shifts in global powers in forms of production and in culture. Do you think it might be interesting to maybe update the term?
I don't know. I know what you mean. I think this is a very specific field of research, you know. It's not about this is forever, and it is all permanently in negotiation and in the process of change. But the line of research, the line of intellectual labor that works with that framework looks into the continuities of those relations in the present. And, you know, even those changes can be analyzed in that lens. So it's not to be, I mean, I was a bit polemic when I said basically it's a description of our normality. And I think this is also where your objection comes from. You know, it was more my polemic than the framework itself. Because the framework itself would say, yeah, of course, things are changing, but how are these changes again connected to this history and these relations, you know? But to answer also differently to your question, I would suggest that there is already a concept, and I think everybody will make like, when I say this here in close to Torino. I think that Gramsci's notion of hegemony and counter-hegemony is actually enough. You do not need much more from my point of view for a good analysis of what is happening, you know, it's the fight for hegemony. Yeah, but I'm sure that doesn't satisfy you as a question.
It's just, I think it's a very, I mean, I find your answer very interesting, and especially bringing the concept of hegemony, I think it's very strong. I just would like to ask a comment, if possible.
Sure.
I think on one particular aspect that I think sometimes is escaping us a little bit. In some parts of the world, the history is very much a history of Western colonialism, and the present is one of still of Western domination. In some other parts of the world, like East Asia, for example, the ruling power at the moment is China.
China, sure.
In many parts of Asia, for example, of Africa.
Yes.
And of course, very few of these actually apply, except patriarchy, which actually still applies. and heterosexuality maybe.
An international division of core and periphery?
Yeah, but that's a comment that I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
Like, to what extent do you think, for example, for that particular section, because maybe paradoxically, it might be very Western-centric to assume coloniality as the only form of
Yeah,
domination.
and that critique has been already developed
Thank
also
you.
by African scholars, like, go away with this analysis, it is just a recentering of your shit, you still want to be important, you know. And I think that is it is very important to keep that in mind. But as I said, and please, I know it sounds like a rejection of your argument, but I think you are 100% right, but only I'm already fine if I can apply this to my own condition. So it is, I didn't try to describe a global reality, but I use it to understand my eerie feelings when I work as an art educator, you know? When the myth, when the promise is that we are changing people's lives, we are working towards liberation, we are working on social equality, we are working on social inclusion. And what I can see as results, and also violence executed in the processes, tells me another story, and I wanted to understand better why. So for me, it is useful to think about European Enlightenment and its effects, not only in the positive way, as the dominant discourse of my working field has it, but also to work with this line of thought from the Americas, which tells another story of modernity. I can understand my own contradictions better. This is how I use it. I'm not a global political analyst. And so I think you are 100% right. Yeah, so I'm really using it as a tool to understand my own practice. I hope you do not see that as like a refusal of your, yes. Yeah.
Can I add a word? Yeah, to this. I do think that you understood each other really well. I think you asked if she was, I'm trying to be a mediator. I believe I understood that you asked if she was universalizing this research. And I believe she answered, I'm not universalizing it, but I am a situated German person in a way with a certain intersectional thing. But I'm trying to not use the excuse of this is not universal to not address it. So paradoxically, I could reverse the question and turn it to you. And in your attempt to say that this is not universal and that if we look at it from the perspective of China, for instance, you could be attempting another universalization at being yet above the world, saying the whole world and relativizing it and saying this question of colonialism and decolonizing is not universal enough, while I will tell you what the whole world is about right now. But you didn't say it. You didn't say it. You didn't say it. But one could presume that that also is based on a preconception that there can be a form of knowledge that is somehow deeper about, because it would embrace all the different perspectives. But I must say, I agree with you completely that when I saw that page and I spoke to Mariana, I said, but this is not at all the situation. I mean, Europe is like nothing now. And look at all the Christians that are being massacred all over the world in countries that were where they were colonized and Christianized. And there's lots of places where that happened, I think. For example, the genocide in Indonesia, that's been spoken about a lot recently, was primarily anti-communist and anti-Christian in the 60s, right? So it doesn't look like something of our time to say Christianity is a privileged religion right now. Almost no religion is a privileged religion right now. It's as if rationality and science is actually not allowing for religions to even,
If you look at
almost exist.
if you look at the
Or it is a religion. Yeah, or it is a religion. Yes, that's true.
I think it's not about individual Christians, but if you look at the geopolitical region where the collective Colonidad, Modernidad is working, there you have still, and I would also say here in this place, not in the museum, but in our part of the world, you still have this dominance. But in the Americas, you have them a lot. I mean, really a lot. And this is also, it's from a perspective, or it's an analysis from a perspective of a part of indigeneity as well, you know, like, and so I think it is not meant as a description of the world as per se, but still you can understand a lot with it. Yeah. Not everything and not all the conditions of the presence, but I can understand this, you know, and this is enough for me. You know, I'm humble. My reach is my own working field, and for that it has been extremely useful, I have to say. Yeah, and I mean we are still, well, now I could rant on this, but I would rather look if there's like more things to say.
Carmen, oh, hello? Okay. Carmen, could I ask you to just develop a bit more the embracing of ambiguity? And I'm thinking of that in relation to the problems we have at the moment with, you know, kind of post-truthness or sort of ambiguity of the wrong kind.
Oh shit, like. Yeah, I see.
And so I was just thinking, because I think the film and the painting together is a structuring of a particular kind of ambiguity.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I would have now drawn to that example.
Yeah.
I realized that in this lecture, the last slide is a bit too much, because it is like it comes across like a program, and then it doesn't get explained at all. And I just felt a bit dizzy when I was now reading it, because this is like yet a completely new lecture. And I think when I say here, embrace ambiguity, I really mean when it comes to what does critical diversity literacy in museum and gallery education mean, you know, like working principles for that. And there I can immediately like tell like 1,000 examples, you know, like for example, the heroism when you work with communities, the paternalism when you work with communities, the paradox of recognition, which many of the participants of the workshop really like took as a concept that was productive for them, meaning that you want to work with certain audiences or communities that are not necessarily represented in your workforce. So just by naming it in a naming them in a certain way, you're already reproducing the ascription to them. And so to really work with the ambiguity, for me, doesn't mean like to put just up with that in a way like, yeah, that's ambiguous, so I don't care, but to go to the maximum of, you know, to try and abandon paternalism, but at the same time not taking an heroic stance in that, say I can be clean of all those problems, you know, I can be devoid of all the contradictions, but try to always keep in mind that that is not possible. So it's something very specific. Yeah. But also on the your example with the kind of how they treated in the Museum Ludwig this conflict, for me is also an embracing of ambiguity, you know, because nobody really was absolutely happy, you know, everybody had to stay with the trouble. It wasn't the solution that did away with any of the problems, but it still dealt with them. And I think this is what I mean with that here. But I think this slide really needs reworking. Anyway.
Grazie a tutte e a tutti, e poi come abbiamo detto nel workshop non c'è mai una prospettiva del tutto giusta e del tutto sbagliata, quindi grazie professor Mörsch, grazie a tutte e a tutti voi. Buona serata.